Good morning. My name is Daniel. People call me Dinko. I'm one of the pastors here at Kindred. So glad to be worshiping with you all this Sunday morning. We are continuing our Crooked Crown series. We're in 1 Samuel 14 today. And I did want to, before we read the passage, just want to give just some context of where we're at in the story at this point. Israel is continuing to battle against the Philistines under, of course, King Saul. He's the king at this time. If you've been with us even a couple weeks now, you know he's already turning out to not be the best king, but we're going to see more of that today as well. But just last Sunday, we did look at the passage where King Saul's son, Jonathan, leads Israel into a pretty great victory, and he displays much faith and trust in God. And I realized as we look into these Old Testament narratives, and as we see much of the warfare actually throughout the Old Testament, I did want to give a reminder. Thank you, Brother Alex, for praying so beautifully for us, and including praying for the various conflicts going on in this world. And I do want to give a reminder of something that I shared back in October when a lot of the Israel-Hamas conflict was reignited. I won't give the full statement as I did back in October, but just want to remind you all, in case you missed it or just in case you forgot. I do want to warn you, and every church has perhaps some different stances, opinions, but here at our church, we do want to just warn against importing biblical and religious significance to what is going on out in the Israel-Hamas conflict, what's happening in Gaza. Just a couple things I want to remind you guys about. We remember that things changed when Christ came. When Jesus came into this world, he came saying, "My kingdom is not of this world." He came saying, "I'm not trying to become a geopolitical ruler." And as much as if you were with us for the Genesis series and all the way up to now, even in 1 Samuel, we see how important the promised land was for God's people, for Abraham, for Isaac, for Jacob, all the way to King Saul, King David, and all the people of the Old Testament. But once again, we remember now that Jesus has come, we actually look forward to a different promised land, a greater promised land. As Hebrews 11 tells us, not the promised land of a geopolitical kingdom, but indeed God's people, as we seek a homeland in Hebrews 11, it is called a better heavenly country, not an earthly one. So all this to say, please don't get me wrong. We do not minimize or ignore what is going on in places like Israel and out in Gaza. We should care, we should pray, we should lament over various wars and suffering. But just to be clear, this is not a holy war. This is not something that we want to stamp God's approval on, any of these actions, but this is earthly warfare. And so just a quick reminder of that. As we look at various warfare in the Old Testament, there we do see a generation of holy war, but we don't apply that to our circumstances now. I just want to make that crystal clear for you. I know it can be confusing. There's a lot to think about with these things. And so if you have any questions, please don't ever hesitate to talk to any of the pastors. But going back to our biblical passage, we just see that God's people have just won a great victory against the Philistines. And so we now turn to 1 Samuel 14, verses 24 to 46. 1 Samuel 14, starting from verse 24. "And the men of Israel had been hard-pressed that day. So Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies.' So none of the people had tasted food. Now when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan, Saul's son, had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. So he had put out the tip of his staff that was in his hand, dipped it in the honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. He got revived because he was hungry. Then one of the people said, 'Your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, Cursed be the man who eats food this day.' And the people were faint. Then Jonathan said, 'My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright, because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. They struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon, and the people were very faint because they didn't eat. The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. So just to explain this a little bit, as soon as they were able to eat, they basically were like ravenous, and they ate the food in an improper way with the blood still in it. Then they told Saul, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood." And he said, "You have dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here." And Saul said, "Disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, let every man bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter them here and eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood." So every one of the people brought his ox with them that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. Then Saul said, "Let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. Let us not leave a man of them." And they said, "Do whatever seems good to you." But the priest said, "Let us draw near to God here. Like before we do anything, let us draw near to God here." And Saul inquired of God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel?" But he did not answer him that day. And Saul said, "Come here, all you leaders of the people, and know and see how this sin has arisen today. For as the Lord lives who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die." But there was not a man among all the people who answered him. Then he said to all Israel, "You shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side." And the people said to Saul, "Do what seems good to you." Therefore Saul said, "O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant this day? If this guilt is in me or in Jonathan my son, O Lord, God of Israel, give Urim. But if this guilt is in your people, Israel, give Thummim." These are a casting of lots. It's like heads or tails, Urim, Thummim. And Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. Then Saul said, "Cast a lot between me and my son Jonathan." Once again, that flip of the coin, by God's will. And Jonathan was taken. It was shown that Jonathan had broken the oath. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me, what have you done?" And Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the tip of the staff that was in my hand. Here I am. I will die." And Saul said, "God do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan." Then the people said to Saul, "Shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day." So the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. This is God's word. There's a recent trainer in the UFC. Yes, I know, another MMA UFC illustration. A recent trainer of other fighters who came under fire in the media because of her extreme training methods. When she trains these other fighters, she doesn't let them drink any water throughout the entire training session. It's kind of extreme, right? It's actually very extreme. There's a lot of people who have spoken out against it in the media. I don't know if you guys know what MMA training is like, but you need a lot of water. It's incredibly taxing. And her idea was, don't drink that water from the whole entire training session, and it will develop a championship mindset. That's how you get a championship mindset. To use and appropriate a Gen Z phrase, this trainer is doing too much. She is doing too much. What does that mean? It means it's over the top. Her methods are extra, if you will. And this certainly applies to Saul's story as well. In our story today, as Saul makes this very extreme, rash vow, this rash, extreme oath, he is doing too much. And you know, when we find, whether we're talking about Saul or you or me, we find that when we are doing too much, when we are going over the top, when we're so extreme, it reveals something. The first thing we see is that doing too much reveals our idolatry. Doing too much often reveals our idolatry. Let's think about Saul, how he made this crazy oath, right? Basically, they're already winning, and the final victory is just right at their fingertips. And he goes, and the Israelites, God's people, Saul's army, they're already hard pressed. They're already so tired. You could imagine what being in warfare is like, probably like MMA training. Maybe, I'm sure it's worse actually. And he says, no one can eat. No one's allowed to eat. Not until the day is over and the victory is won. And we will find, as we study this passage together today, this morning, that oath is not ultimately something he does out of devotion to God. That oath is something he makes because there are idols at work deep within his heart. Saul makes this extreme oath. And I do find that when we're extreme about things, whatever we're extreme about, whether it's our extreme reactions or extreme lengths that we're willing to go for whatever it may be, being extreme reveals what comes first for us. What you're extreme about reveals what's first for you. Think about just when do you find yourself in your most extreme moments? When do you find yourself doing too much? Perhaps an extreme reaction, something triggers you and you react very extremely. You get very angry, you get very defensive. Or you go to extreme lengths to acquire or accomplish something. And it's not just you're willing to sacrifice and go hard, but it's extreme. People say, whoa, that's too much. You're doing too much. They often reveal where our idols lie. There's a recent documentary on Netflix. A lot of you have seen it, and it hits kind of hard for perhaps our audience because it's a documentary about something that has happened locally and continues to happen locally. Involves even a church, a so-called church leader who is local, maybe even familiar to some of you here. It's a documentary called Dancing for the Devil. Right? It involves a cult-like situation with a cult-like leader who kind of entraps or seduces and abuses and manipulates TikTok dancers, right, of all people. And whenever I talk about that documentary with people, one of the first things that people always say is, why do they follow that guy? Why do those dancers follow that guy, that cult leader guy? Why do they follow him? And the answer is pretty simple, biblically speaking. They follow him because he appeals to their idols. I don't know if you've seen the documentary, but if you have, he talks a lot about money, right? He talks a lot about riches and wealth. Nothing wrong with riches and wealth in and of itself. But of course, when it's the only thing I care about, it's very easy to be manipulated by someone promising you those things. But by someone promising you even the fulfillment of all your dreams. That's all he does. That's his way of operating. That's his MO. And it's not a coincidence, right? The title of the documentary is Dancing for the Devil, and that's exactly how Satan operates too. He reveals that even as he tries to tempt Jesus. Think about the 40 days in the wilderness as Jesus fasts, and Satan tries to tempt him all along the way. What is he tempting him with? Is it not the classic idols of comfort, of approval, of power, of control? And Satan loves to appeal to those idols for you and to you and to me as well. And oftentimes, what we're extreme about will reveal that. I love what the counselor Paul Tripp once wrote. He wrote this: "The deepest issues of life are issues of worship. Worship is more fundamental to our essential nature than the pain, pressures, or pleasures of our experiences. What we worship determines our responses to all of our experiences. Sin is much more than doing the wrong thing. It begins with loving, worshiping, and serving the wrong thing. Why did I react like that to my spouse? Why did I snap at my kids? Why did I react like that in that meeting? It's easy to say, well, it's the circumstance. It's the thing that's bothering me. It's this outside thing. It's this, I've been having a hard day, or it's been hard, or something bad happened to me, and that's why I'm reacting this way. And there is, of course, truth to all those situations, but we have to ask ourselves, what is the idol underneath that's bringing out those extreme responses? What is that idol that if Satan or anyone else for that matter just pricks it a little bit, makes me do things that are rash, makes me go too far, makes me do too much? It's an important question to ask ourselves. And what's remarkable in our story is Saul does this extreme thing, makes this extreme rash vow, this oath that ultimately puts his own son in danger of being killed unnecessarily. Saul does this when they're winning. He does this when they're winning. If you were with us last week, you remember Saul had a different blunder, right? He did too much. He had no chill. He tried to control everything, and he made a sacrifice he wasn't authorized to make when they were losing, when things were hard, when he was scared. And you have some compassion for that, right? Oh my, yeah, he was desperate. That's why he did the wrong thing. He was desperate. He was stuck between a rock and a hard place. But here he is now winning. He is winning, and he is still doing things all out of order. When God is not your foundation, even winning is riddled with anxiety and insecurity. Even winning will not be enough when God is not your foundation. Let's look at our passage again, 1 Samuel 14:24. I think there's something very telling in this passage when Saul makes that oath, that extreme oath. Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening. And note this part of the phrase, until I am avenged on my enemies. I think until I am avenged on my enemies reveals a lot. It reveals it's actually really about him. When you make an oath, you're doing that before God, right? It invokes God. It brings God into the picture. So it kind of seems spiritual. It kind of seems religious. But at the end of the day, that last phrase reveals what it's really about. Until I am avenged. We all know this, right? War should never be about avenging a king. It should never be about one leader saying, until I'm avenged, let's keep fighting. But that's what it has become. And that's the real kicker about idolatry. When we serve our idols before God, usually our idols, comfort, safety, power, approval, those things are not bad in and of themselves. But when we seek those things before God, what's the reality? When everything I do, especially the extreme lengths I go and the extreme reactions I give, serve my idols of comfort, of power, of control, of approval. Ultimately, it's just serving myself. It's serving me. That's what Saul's revealing. I don't know why I keep saying Paul. That's why Saul reveals, until I am avenged. Until I am avenged. It's about him. It's about him. That's the first thing we see. Doing too much reveals our idolatry, and our idolatry is ultimately just about serving ourselves. Here's the second thing. Idolatry can easily hide in religiosity. Idolatry can easily hide in religiosity. If you were with us last week, you remember Saul already. He's been told that he's been rejected as the king at this point. One chapter ago in 1 Samuel 13, he's been told that his dynasty will no longer continue. And I love what a pastor by the name of Derek Thomas once noted. He noted, ever since then, Saul got more religious. He got more religious ever since he's been told this. He's in this really insecure place now, and so he's more religious than ever. After all, once again, making an oath. Cursed is anyone who eats food until nighttime. That's religious, because you're bringing God into the picture. Kindred's only been around for a little more than a year now, but I think one of the most fire moments from this Kindred pulpit is actually when our missionary, David Nam, spoke for us not too long ago. And I just remember what he said was so impactful to me, where he said, as a missionary in Taiwan, there's a lot of literal idols, right? Shrines and temples where people go to pray and they pray before these figures and these statues, and because they're in this special place, this religious place, burning incense, things like that, praying for, wealth, praying for their kids, praying that they could have, acquire property and all these things. And then the fire moment, of course, was when he said, don't we as Christians often do the same thing in our prayers? Right? And I was like, that is fire. That is fire, as the young people say. And it's easy to say, well, I'm going to church. I'm praying. I'm reading the Bible. But God knows. And I think on self-examination, don't judge anyone else, but examine your own heart. It is easy to serve our idols, even with spiritual and religious practice. Please be careful, my brothers and sisters, because it is easy. It is easy for idols to hide in our religiosity. Saul gets more and more religious, but you could argue he gets more and more idolatrous. But we do see some signs that his religion is ultimately serving himself and not serving God. There's a passage in 1 Samuel 14 that we did not read, where he even, during the warfare, during the battle with the Philistines, he even brings the ark of God into the battle again. You guys remember that from early in 1 Samuel chapter 4, I believe, where they bring the ark of God to the battle, and it's like a bad move? Well, here's Saul doing that again. But look at this, right? It's really telling. In verses 18 and 19, Saul says, bring the ark of God here, for the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. Now, while Saul was talking to the priest, so, he's like getting the priest ready to do something with God's ark, the Ark of the Covenant, a very special religious item, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. In other words, the Philistines were losing. They were losing. There was all this commotion amongst the Philistines because they're hard pressed. And Saul goes, never mind. You don't need to bring the ark. Withdraw your hand. It's like, bring the ark. Oh wait, the Philistines are losing? Never mind. We don't need it. And then it gets worse, actually, in verse 36, which we did read. Here's now Saul wanting to go into battle again to achieve that final victory over the Philistines because they're already losing. And then there's a very important, very big but here. It says, but the priest said, hey, shouldn't we draw near to God first? Shouldn't we go to God? It's like we see this great, or not great, this terrible progression. Here's Saul doing all these religious things, first of all, he starts with making this huge oath, right? That's what we did read. He makes this unnecessary commitment. He makes this unnecessary new rule for God's people that goes above and beyond for no reason. But here's also Saul saying, bring the ark. Oh, never mind, we're winning, never mind. And then when he wants to battle again, he doesn't even think about God anymore. The priest has to say, wait, shouldn't we go to God first? Then it's this terrible progression. Phil Long, the Old Testament scholar, he writes this about Saul and about us. How true this pattern can be in the lives of those who don't take God seriously. When God does not occupy first place, he seldom remains long in second, but is quickly relegated to ever lower standing until he is forgotten altogether. That is the progression we see with Saul. He no longer occupies first place. Maybe he never did. But he doesn't stay at second for long, and he gets forgotten altogether. You know, a common phrase we see in social media profiles amongst Christians is God first. God first. Those are two wonderful words put together to form a great statement. God first. But we all got to admit, it is one thing to write God first on your profile. It is another thing to live with God being first in your life. I'll be the first to confess, I am not an expert. I am not the best at putting God first. I fail to put God first. I'll be the first to confess. But is it something we are seeking? Is it something we want? I want God first in my life. Because I recognize if he's not first in my life, then he won't be second either. He won't be third. He'll get forgotten altogether. That is a pattern we see throughout the biblical history, but also just history itself. God has to be first. There's a proper order to things. When you put things out of order, when you just put one thing in the wrong place, when things are perfectly in order, it becomes chaos and commotion. You know, think about music, right? The notes are in an order, the right order to create a beautiful melody. You start putting notes in different places, you start to get cacophony, right? You start to get chaos. It's not that beautiful melody anymore. And it's true about God too. God has a right order that he needs to be in our hearts, in our lives, and it is first. It is first. You know, at our sending church, Christ Central, I remember a little while ago, some of the leaders took a survey of various Christians and in the membership of Christ Central, our sending church. And the questions were about their parents' influence on their spirituality. And I think something that was noteworthy, but certainly not surprising, was how many people mentioned the importance of their parents going to church every Sunday. It's important, right? That makes a difference. That made a difference on their lives. Not to guilt trip you if you don't go to church every Sunday, not to say, shame on you, but I think it is a very, very powerful way to demonstrate God being first. That he comes first in our week. He comes first every week in the way we order our days even. But please note this. I'm not saying going to church, period. Just go to church one Sunday. But I think what that survey showed us was the power of these parents and the influence they had on these kids when they prioritized going to church, not just period, but every Sunday. Because it demonstrates it's every Sunday. It's not just when I think I need it, particularly today. Right? When I'm feeling like there's something hard in my life, so I need to go to church to fix this problem. Or, I had kids now, and I want my kids to grow up well. I want them to have a good foundation. So now I'll go to church. Those might be, praise be to God if you're coming to church, but what I want to encourage you to consider is what happens when that hard thing is not in your life anymore? When things are good again? Will you not want to worship God? Or what happens when your kids that you wanted to go to church for, you're an empty nester now? They're not in your home now. Will going to church taper off? Or, something that I think all of us struggle with, me included. What happens when you don't care so much about the opinions of others anymore? When you realize what other people think of me, it's not that important. Will my church attendance taper off then? Or is coming to church, doing things like coming to church every Sunday, reading the Bible, prayer. Am I doing those things not for any other reason other than because God is first? That's the difference, right? That's what makes all the difference. Once again, idolatry can easily hide in religiosity. So I'm not saying just come to church every Sunday instantly means God is first. But it is a great way to practice that and make sure you're doing that in your own heart. Make sure you're prioritizing, putting God in the right order of your life. Because when we do that, we will find the ultimate answer, actually. When we do that, that is when we find the ultimate comfort, the ultimate power, the ultimate security. It's not bad. No one should feel guilty for wanting those things. But the real question is, where are you looking for those things? Where are you looking? And that leads us to our last point, because we ultimately need a ransom, not religiosity, not idolatry. You know, the tragedy of King Saul's son, Jonathan, the tragedy of his story is that he is actually very, very righteous, and he would actually make a great king. He leads the Israelites into victory. He has so much trust and faith in God. He's just clearly a good dude. He would have made a great king, but the dynasty is now severed through Saul's sin. And there's something tragic there. He would have been such a great king, but now he can't be. And it's tragic because Saul even doesn't seem to value Jonathan enough. You know, we see that in this story today, right? You know what's interesting is Saul, he is very merciful early on in his story. If you guys recall in 1 Samuel 11, there were people who were saying bad things about Saul. They're saying, this guy's going to be our king? Is this guy going to save us? Is this guy going to really help us? And the people gather and they say, let's kill those guys who are saying that about our king. Because they're clearly treacherous, they're bad guys, and they're worthless men, as the Bible said. But Saul is so merciful. He says, no man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel. And we're thinking, what a good guy, what a good king. And yet when it comes to his own son, just 3 chapters later, he's like, you shall surely die, Jonathan. You shall surely die. And it's not Saul that stops Jonathan from dying, from being killed because of that oath, but it's the people. They gather together and they say, they make their own oath. As sure as God lives, you will not kill Jonathan. God was with Jonathan. God used Jonathan. God is a good guy. Jonathan's a good guy. And we will not let him be put to death. And it says in verse 45, so the people ransomed Jonathan. You know, Jonathan, the righteous son, points us forward to another righteous son, to the supremely righteous son, who, unlike Jonathan, would actually become the king of kings. And while Jonathan would be ransomed by the people, Jesus, our king, would become the ransom for his people. Because the thing is, we all need someone to vouch for us at the end of the day. For a foolish, extreme oath, all it took was the consensus of the people speaking for Jonathan, vouching for Jonathan. For a sin against a holy God, for all of our sin against a holy God, we need much more. We have a king who actually no one would vouch for, not even his closest friends. And he would be crucified so that he could vouch for us before God, and so that he could become our ransom. We read this passage not too long ago, around Good Friday. Mark 15, 12-14, Pontius Pilate said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. Jesus would deserve so much more than Jonathan, but he would get so much worse, so that you and I could be vouched for before our holy God. You know, when this king is your king, when he is in the right place, the right order, when he is put first, God does not withhold his good gifts. Not because you've earned it by putting him in the right place, but because when everything is in the right order, you get everything working as it should in your life, in your heart, in your mind, in the way we operate, in the way we live our lives. Not because of some works righteousness, but because God is in the right place. Once again, there's nothing wrong with wanting comfort, with wanting safety, with wanting a sense of power and control in your life. There's nothing wrong with that. But note this, in God alone do we have the ultimate comfort. He is the God of all comfort, as the Bible tells us. You know, in God, we actually have a new kind of power that is not of this world, that is not of ourselves, that's fueled by love for self, but it's a power that comes from God and God alone. The Bible calls this the power that comes from the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And in God, we have the ultimate approval, where he looks on you and he sees a beloved child, a beloved son, a beloved daughter, and he treats you the way he would treat Jesus, because Jesus is yours. And in God, we actually are okay when we're not in control, because we rest in God's control and his sovereignty. Brothers and sisters, we all, as John Calvin once said, are idol factories. We make idols in our hearts again and again. It's second nature for us. But would you look to the scriptures today? Would you look at Saul's blunder? And would it point us once again, not to how much we're not like Saul, but how much we are, and how much we need to reflect and recognize, where are the areas that I find myself being so extreme, where underneath that is certainly an idol, whatever that idol may be. And would you place that at the foot of the cross? Would you place that at the feet of Christ and reorient, recenter back on him? Let's do that at this time. Let's pray together. Could you come before God at this time? You may be thinking of a great many things. But as you think, what are the idols of my own heart? What are the idols that I serve, which ultimately just serves me? And lay it at the foot of the cross. Would you say to God this morning, Lord, I really do want you to be first, but it's hard. Help me to put you first. Would you pray this at this time now? And in a few moments, our worship team will close us in a song of response.